Wonderful. So I will be watching our waiting room, letting people in, and I'm going to turn it over now to Chris, who's going to take us into part three, tree selection, planting, and construction considerations. Last week it was long-term maintenance and living green infrastructure, making a very big distinction between green infrastructure and living green infrastructure, focusing on plants. And so take it away, Chris, week three, trees in the urban environment.
Okay, well, thank you, Astrid. And thank you, Gaia College, too, because that was my one source stop for figuring out stuff that I've been trying to figure out for many years. I, too, just from a land acknowledgement point of view, I'm in what's called the Haldeman Track. It's the Grand River in southern Ontario. It's the Haudenosaunee. And interestingly, someone said this, it was not related to Canada specifically, but they said in regards to the Holy Land is not a place somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere else, depending on what your background is. It's actually the place under your feet. And I thought that was kind of poignant. Okay, so this is part three of 4 parts, and we talked about how we got into the urban situation initially, and so what homeowners, residents, and even farmers inherited from colonialism over the past 300 years. And then part 2, we talked about some very basic landscape maintenance practices that would support your trees. And here we're talking about trees, but you can't talk about trees without talking about the whole urban landscape. And so we talked generally about the urban landscape far more than trees in part 2. Today we're going to talk about, I put it in as tree selection, planting and construction considerations. When it comes to tree selection, I'm not going to go into where we're generally focused on largely, which is genetic adaptation of plant material to climate change. And for instance, the idea of assisted migration, where we look at moving plant material from other climatic regions into ours ahead of time. I'm going to focus more when it comes to plant selection on the quality of your plant, understanding what you have received in your hands, and the planting procedure and the consequences, things to consider. And then I'm just going to lightly touch on construction. And then next week, if anybody is going to tune in, we're going to talk about pruning and other tree management practices. But pruning is a very big thing. It's, as an arborist, it's a very significant income stream to us. And there's things that are accepted and there's not a lot of science behind some of the things we do these days. And so you might want to make sure if you hire somebody to come in and look at pruning practices that you make sure they're sort of up to date on things. We're going to look at what's beneficial and what's not beneficial. Okay, let's move on. Okay, this is the thing that often gets me is we've worked over the years coming up with development standards, and forgive me, this is kind of an Ontario perspective because I really don't get out that much. Okay, so there's all kinds of great documentation. For instance, if you are in Ontario, and this would apply, this is useful to Quebec or Manitoba, any other area. You can go onto the Landscape Ontario website and get this recent landscape tree planting guideline. It's got a lot of the big hitters that came together in the industry to put it together. I'm going to say it probably could have been better. But again, what I always find the challenge is in our industries, the green industries, is our associations have to first support the well-being of their members, and that's financially and that's income streams. And so often that's a challenge in making a change out there in the landscape. Okay, enough politics. Okay, here we have a beautiful little site. I think this is somewhere in Kitchener, Cambridge, schoolyard. We have a tree has been planted, and it's got a gator bag on it for watering, which is great. They're not always ideal, but believe me, they've saved a lot of trees. It's been guided with wood stakes and looks like arbor tie, which has failed a little bit. Everything was put in place as best we can to ensure the survival of this tree. But clearly, if you look around the landscape it's in, you might think it may have a challenge in making it to a mature tree. I keep bringing this slide up, and again, don't get caught up on the numbers, but if you look at this number here under the middle, Proctor density method.
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing your slideshow, so I'm going to make you host again, and that should correct it. Okay, so there it is. We see it now.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll back up quickly here. Well, it's good because I was talking over stuff that really is not poignant. Do you see this slide here, this boar tree in a schoolyard?
The gator bag?
You put the gator bag? Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, I do.
So we threw everything at it from a landscape architect perspective. Got the gator bag. We had the wood stakes. We had arbor tie on it, and mulch on there. But its challenge ultimately will be where it's living. So I throw this in. I think I've done it 3 times now in 3 presentations, and don't get caught up on the numbers here. But that schoolyard and most building sites in the past 40 years have been compacted to levels that would ensure that we can build anything anywhere on it. But that usually means there's no organic matter because you cannot compact organic matter. So if we're looking at threshold for root growth, and this is from the perspective of trees, there are other plants, turnips, for instance, root vegetables, they can grow in amazing places. But we're challenged when we get over about 80% proctor density. And all proctor density means is the theoretical level that you could potentially compact the soil and can't go any further. So roots are actually very incredible that they can go through this, but we're developing whole sites, and we're up here all the time in here. So that'll become apparent as we go on. So moving ahead, this is just the Cole's notes of what we do in development. And if you live in an older neighborhood, you will not be experiencing many of the things I'm talking about. I'm talking about largely urbanization, suburbia, these places, urban sprawl that we're talking. And these are the areas that are seriously affecting, for instance, our flooding situations. So this is a site, I won't say where it is, where there's probably 3 feet of fill put into it. It's a park. It's a naturalized park. And then there's, it might have even been a foot of topsoil put in on top of it, but it was highly screened, topsoil with no soil structure, and we can talk about that if somebody's interested. What happens is you add a level of compaction to a level of compaction to the point where you're planting a 1 or 2 gallon potted plant, then you're needing an auger or an excavator. Then you're planting something out of a container that has all these circling roots. We put it in that landscape, and then we say, you know, God bless you, you're a native plant, you will survive. Well, here's a couple pictures of a high-end municipality in the GTA, Greater Toronto area. These trees were planted really high landscape specification that went into this very visible area to the municipality. They wanted to do the right thing. The soil was specified, the plants approved, planted, even irrigation put in place. But you start looking around here, and these are dying trees, clearly. The one on the right is clearly died. But you see this crack going around here, around where the original root ball went in. This is something that's becoming a chronic problem. And if you look over here on the left part of your screen, there's two things going on. The way we grow trees is we end up often planting them too deep. You see where that brown or dark band is on the stem of this tree, and you look where the root system is down here. This came out of a container. We'll talk about containers. Here's another picture in the bottom left here, where you see the circling roots. Actually, this one's so close to constricting and killing the tree. So we have a lot of challenges when it comes to planting trees, and it's far greater than trying to figure out what the genetic best source is for trees, because we just need to get them to live. Okay, so here's a few things that are going on. When we grow trees, and this is kind of industry standard, it might be different across the country, I'm not sure. But when we germinate a seed, we put them in what we call a liner, which is a fabric little cloth. The seed germinates here, puts its stem up on the top left there, puts its stem up, and then generates its root system. But the root system is contained by this liner, and it's forced downwards into the ground. So what happens very often is when we get a container tree, the plant, we plant it at the grade where the physiological root flare would have been, at the very top. That's where we put it, but the root system is forced down quite a ways and then has to come out. So very often we're burying our trees and our shrubs. And so on top of that, if you go over to the center here, you can see where potentially the first potted area was around here. This tree gets transplanted out into another pot, okay? And its roots grow out. If it was in a pot, its roots may have grown into a physical barrier, a plastic container. And now it's planted in a larger pot, and any roots that get out beyond that grow out again into a physical container. So we have circling roots in here. We have circling roots out here. And you can kind of see that on the top right here, where you can see the original pot and where the root system was, and then the larger pot. We do this because it's a lot cheaper and faster to grow trees than planting them in fields in real soil. We can grow them above ground. We can grow them in poly houses, and we can grow them much faster. So a little close up here is this little tree. It looks like it might be a spruce or something like that. It was in a liner, and it germinated here, and the root system was forced downwards to the bottom here through the liner. And then you can see the response to the root system trying to come back up and going out. So we're 2 to 3 inches, 50 to 75, 80 centimeters below what the natural physiological crown was, where you might say the root flare was, where the transition from the trunk to the root system would be. It'll be there. All right. So as we transplant from one pot to another, you may buy a plant that looks like this on the left side of the screen. And when you go to pull it out, you get this, okay? So just be prepared that there could be surprises along the way. Clearly, when these trees were delivered, they had just been freshly transplanted. And so what you would see here, actually, this is a great opportunity to check for those circling roots. This is not a bad scenario if you get this, because you can nip it in the bud. It's great to have all the excess planting soil that's in this one on the left. These are the same size plants. They have the same root system. So really, there's things that happen along the way. You just need to be prepared for. So how do we deal with this? You see the picture on the right? This is very common. That's just an absolute mass. It's actually a barrier. The trees created a barrier within the plastic barrier, which prevents itself from growing. And these roots will circle and circle and circle and circle and circle. They can't break out of that cycle very easily, especially if you're in compacted soils. So there's things that you can do, and you have to. In this diagram on the left, we're talking about actually stripping off the outer, say, inch layer of the whole thing to get rid of that. You still don't know if there's circling roots inside it from a previous pot. You'd have no idea about that, but you can do that. But the easy thing to do if you're dealing with this is just get a very sharp utility knife and cut this mass up and down, all the way around. It's brutal. It really is. And pluck all the ends of the roots out as best you can. And that will often make all the difference to the longevity of that plant. The other thing is, I'm not sure it's been shown in the other slides, is because of the liner's growth, is not only do you get all these circling roots, but you also get a root system that's buried 2 to 3 inches too deep in the pot, which makes it very easy to bury too deep. So how prevalent is this? Well, I can't tell you how prevalent this is. It's just chronic, absolute chronic. This is just one site. This is like 3 pots in a row pulled out. These are shrubs or small trees. And this is what you see. So we don't want these big circling roots around. It seems counterproductive to cut them, but in the long term, for this plant to give us the benefits we're looking at over the years to reach the size, we have to. So this is just the state of the industry. This is how we grow plants largely. So there's container grown plants. There's field grown plants, which are your balled and burlapped or your wire basket plants. They're usually for bigger trees. They're much more expensive, and the neat thing for most people about container grown plants is you can grow them faster, and they're far lighter because they're growing in a modified soil, which makes them easier to handle. So the average person, contractor, or homeowner can handle them. But if you don't understand this is what you have, potentially you're going to have a suffering or a dead plant or tree. It's just a picture of a tree that is grown out of a container where it was planted at the grade, which looks to be correct, but remember the root system is way down here. So planted too deep. If you don't see a root flare here from the trunk moving out into your mulch or your landscape, that's something you might to be you need to be aware of. Here's another great example. This is a beautiful little sugar maple. Planted too deep, you see no root flare here. It's turning a beautiful color, but it shouldn't be doing that in July. Okay, so clearly there's a sign something's going on. You can see no root flare there. So these are planting considerations. It's not the genetics of the plant at this time and space. It's just getting our plants to live. Okay, so we're just going to flip over and talk a little bit about construction. Many municipalities have tree bylaws now. Many of them have them for public trees, public spaces. Quite a few now have bylaws for private trees, private tree protection. And typically you'll see on an area that's going to have construction, what we call a TPZ, or a tree protection zone. And it can be a very light duty thing, or it could be actually quite fortified, depending on the municipality. But this is generally what it looks like. So it generally goes up to any hard surface, but it can be out to the tree line in some municipalities, not often, but it's usually based on a formula to protect the root system. And sorry about the quality of this. This is just a screenshot from the town of Oakville in the Greater Toronto region. They're probably the granddaddy of tree bylaws because they were impacted very early with urbanization. And you can see if you have a tree here on the left of a certain size, there's a corresponding size of tree protection. For instance, if you have a 10 to 30 centimeter diameter tree, they require you to have a 2.4 meter tree protection zone. So that's 2.4 meters from the base of the tree out in all directions. So that usually falls actually far underneath the tree canopy cover. But that's kind of an accepted norm for it. And it goes on up over tree sizes where you can have really significant size tree protection zones. Now, they're not always called tree protection zones. I've seen them called many things, vegetation zones or vegetation and soil protection zones. But the intent is the same, is to protect this rooting area in here. So here's just a little example of something you might want to expect and consider if you're ever involved in this on your property, or if you're in a municipality, is if there's construction nearby, you have your tree protected here, but how protected is your tree? Because we're following all the guidelines in choosing the tree protection zone size on this tree. We're excavating over here, and now in this next picture on the top right, we're going to move over to this area beside this. This is an underground electrical vault where they're going to excavate. So we use hydrovac, hydro evacuation, or evacuation. It's a combination of air vacuum and water pressure to liquefy the soil and vacuum it up so it's not invasive. It's not as invasive. So the idea is that it's not invasive to your hard infrastructure, your gas pipelines, your hydro cables, whatnot. It can be very impactful on your trees. So here we have this picture here on the right. We see the hydrovac going down below the root system, and this root system that you see exposed here is over here outside the tree protection zone. Okay, so the interesting thing about hydrovac is they can really benefit your tree, but if you don't know what you're doing, they can also provide serious injury. What's happened here, in this case, is the wand pressure from the water, which the gentleman on the left here is holding, was significantly high. And you see all those white roots, they've been killed, absolutely killed. And on the bottom right, that's what you see. You've actually seen the cambium blown completely off the root system. Here's one little spot here where it still exists. This is a significant injury to the tree. So if anybody's involved in doing this kind of excavation and construction sites or whatever, it's a very easy thing to control because this technology is very good, but these operators like to go really fast. As you turn down the wand pressure, you can imagine, the water pressure coming out of a hose, and you can turn it up high enough to hurt your hand. You can imagine it's the same for your root system. So what you do is basically you turn it down, you find a sacrificial root, and you lay it on the ground and put your foot on it, hold it there, and you put your wand pressure over it, the water pressure, and see where you start negatively impacting that root, and then you back it off from there. Usually it's under 600 pounds per square inch. This is very significant because this technology is recognized as being a tree savers, but I've actually seen them in many cases kill trees, and I've gone back and done forensic reports and redug everything up with a hydrovac again to find that the roots were actually killed off. So technology can work for you, but you just need to be aware of how to use it. And two quickies to end up here before we go into questions is clearly on the right. We know this, it happens all the time. Mower and weed trimmer injury over time. This tree here is 50% girdled. It's done. It'll never contribute to the urban tree cover that we want. And this is so easily avoided. The trouble is, very often, it doesn't happen so much on private properties, but it happens on institutional properties, municipal properties, that sort of thing. And it's summer students that we're not given enough guidance. It's not their doing, but it's completely preventable, and it doesn't cost anything not to damage these trees. So what if there's a little tuft of longer grass growing around this tree? We would have this tree still, and this tree is gone. And on the left, this is just an example of a tree that had a lot of mulch on it. It's a tree spaded tree, so it's put in, it was in a little bit high, but what you can see happened, there was excessive amount of mulch. It's all been cleared off in here, and it pulled developing root system up into the mulch. It didn't allow the root system to go down and find its equilibrium in the ground where it really needs to be sustainable over time. So it's one of those things, a little bit is good, a lot really can backfire on you. And very often we see areas that are heavily over mulched. If you have a very mature tree and you're trying to support its well-being over time, you might consider taking up all the turf all around it and mulching. It's not going to have quite the same negative impact as a young tree. A young tree is going to be reaching up there right away. So anyhow, mimic nature, right? 2, possibly 3 inches of mulch. The reason we mulch heavily is because we don't like to come back and do it again. But we really just want it to break down and become part of the soil system. And so it is important to come back and replace what nature would do in a forest over time. So there's 2 things that are very easy and cause nothing that would benefit your trees. So just quickly, for anyone that's around next week, we'll look at how trees grow, and we'll talk specifically about pruning and other practices. and whether they're beneficial or not. But at this point, I think we're open for questions.
Okay, that's beautiful, Chris. Thank you very much. And we do have about 10 minutes for questions, and you can unmute yourself and ask the question of Chris, or you can type it in the chat, and we'll take it from there. And perhaps you stop your slideshow, Chris, and maybe put your camera on, and I will do the same. Oops. Okay. Excellent. Well, I seem to be having trouble. I really like what you said, sustainable over time. So the practices that are going to lead to healthy trees over time, that's the goal. But we're bombarded with the alarming stats that the average city tree only lives about 12 years, and we know that trees can live much, much longer. So is there a prevailing attitude that replacement is just part of doing business, and so sustainable, healthy trees living over time is just out of reach?
Well, it's both. It is accepted that trees in the urban setting, specifically super highly urbanized downtown cores, will be replaced because they don't have the soil volume, and they deal with, in many communities, with excessive, for instance, salt, vandalism, all this kind of stuff. So in those cases, actually 12 years is probably considered a good number. I know some communities where it's 7. So without a complete infrastructure overhaul in the streetscapes, and that's happening in some communities, those trees are always going to suffer. In the urban landscape, if we're talking the homeowner, your tree has far better opportunity depending on what your landscape maintenance practices are. But basically, if you live in a highly urbanized area, any city across Canada, you inherited a dog and pony show, for sure. But it's not something that you can't improve on. And through your landscape maintenance, and we talked about this last week, if you actually care for your turf, it's ironic you're caring for your trees as well if you do it in the right context. So it's the old thing, having nature work with you, right? That's what you want. You want nature working with you, not against you. And newer neighborhoods, I'm going to go out and say most of them are being developed worse than they ever have been, despite our higher development standards, which are available, as just seems to be the way it is. And then occasionally you'll see a developer that gets it and steps up and sets the standard. So it's one of those things. The thing that's going to drive the well-being of the landscape and trees, we're talking trees, but you can't take them away from the whole living green infrastructure thing, is in most communities is this whole flooding issue. And the Insurance Bureau of Canada said in the last, I'm just paraphrasing, last 15 years, their payouts for natural catastrophes has been greater than the last 50 years. And 75% of that was urban flooding. So clearly we don't have a lot of pervious surfaces, and we assume that our landscapes are pervious surfaces, and in many cases they're not. They're contributors to the problem just because of the way they were built and the way they're maintained, and it's completely unnecessary, and it's an easy fix. So there's politics involved in that.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just looking in the chat, and we have Michael Hermery. Welcome, Michael, who's asked about trees being available as bare root stock. Is that an even better scenario for the survival of trees?
You know, if you go back, he's probably dating himself. You go back far enough, that's what we had, is bare root stock. And you can make it work, but you have to be committed, because there's if you're planning on a large scale, you got to make sure you have to have cold storage initially. Everything has to be protected, but it did work. But in here, and forgive me, it's kind of an Ontario perspective. Our landscapes are so have been messed up for years, okay, and so it's very challenging. I know, for instance, bare root stock will be planted out to nursery growers. They'll do this all the time because they know how to look after their trees, and they'll do it really well, and they'll get great growth out of them. But to put them out into an urban landscape on that level would require the knowledge and the care of nursery grower. And so it kind of limits the potential for that under this situation. And the great irony is, of course, you don't have the weight, you don't have many of the issues with containers and field-grown trees and wire baskets and whatnot, but it's not something that a municipal crew could likely do. An arboretum could, clearly, but not a municipal crew or landscape contractor. So if there was any way of making that work, but that comes back to where are we planting it? And these, the landscape is not what it was years ago.
So challenging because of what we're dealing with, but it also is very limited in the window of opportunity, right? Isn't that part of it?
Well, that's that's a huge part of it. And
right. So and in GTA, every you're planting almost as many days of the year if you can, right?
Well, and also, well, here's a stat for you. If you're doing a restoration project in the Greater Toronto region, and you think we're looking for improvements, but as far as vegetative cover, we're probably looking at 50% survival rate. So it ends up causing two problems. One, we overplant to ensure we have enough vegetative cover. And two, we take all those potential plants out of the system and a time where we are lacking access to plants to put them elsewhere. Right. So this is just the way things are. So no, I don't think I don't think that that idea of bare root stock works with anybody that really doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And if they do, it works.
Well, I feel good. I like doing the bare root because I like to see what I got. But of course, it's a very short window. And I thank you for that question, Michael, and also those in the chat. Uh, like I said, this is recorded, so spread the word. We're out of time. Thank you, Chris. So informative. And how we grow trees, the implications of pruning and other tree management practices are what you're going to talk about next week. So I'm excited to hear about that too. Thank you so much, everybody. Um, really appreciate it, Chris. Thank you. And we'll see you next week. Have a great week, everybody.
Good. Thank you.
Bye for now.